everyone, welcome back to my channel. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Joanna Holden, and I am a fantasy author as well as being an author tuber, and today's video is part 4 in my world building series. I know this has been a long time in coming. I am so excited to finally have all the information here and organized and ready to share with you. Very quickly, 2 things. First of all, if you're new here, consider subscribing. I post weekly content about fantasy writing, world building, series building, all the things pertaining to writing and specifically to writing fantasy series. So if you are interested in that and writing inspiration and the how-to of my own personal writing journey from first draft to published, then definitely click the subscribe button. Secondly, my daughter is awake and I do not have a babysitter, so she is going to be in the background a little bit in this video. I think she should be fine. She's got on her passy, she's got her toys, she's got her books. But if you hear something in the background, it's just her. I have her contained, I can see her, so no worries. But just that will be in the background. So my apologies for the inconvenience and thank you so much for understanding. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of history in your fantasy world building. The very first thing that you want to look at when you are talking about creating a history for your world is that history is tightly intertwined with culture. And we all know how important it is to properly develop and build unique and very well-developed, thought-through cultures for our fantasy worlds. So you can't really skip either step. So if you're thinking that, oh, I'll just come up with some cool fantasy races and some cool fantasy country names and I'll just kind of go forward, you may want to backtrack just a little bit and to think through, because history affects everything. And not only history, but also perceived history. This is the second of the first 2 points, I guess I should have said. Sorry, the first 2 points. So the second of the first 2 points is that not only must you figure out the history of your world and of these nations, these peoples that you have come up with, but you must also understand the difference between actual factual history and perceived history. This is not just one more thing you have to do either. This can create so much more plot conflict, like external conflict, as well as character journeys. Because if you have a character who comes from one country and another character who comes from another country, and their countries have had a war, both countries are going to have opposite views of what happened in that war. The one country is going to blame the other, vice versa. They're going to have different perceptions of who actually won and of like how the victory went down, of the various betrayals, of the political intrigue. There's going to be so much going on both sides that neither side is going to completely 100% agree with the other on how everything went down. No matter what the historical event, different people groups are going to have different versions of what actually happened. And as many famous people have said, it's the victors who write history books. So the actual events and then how people perceive them, even globally, can be completely different. So don't forget to be thinking about that as you're going through and writing your history. You don't need to go crazy with it if you already have so much complexity in your story. A lot of this history is going to be for you personally. And then again, a lot of it is going to help you as you try to understand the cultures that you are going to be developing in the next and last segment of this series. So history is incredibly crucial, but don't forget that there is real and then there's perceived history, and to just include that as much as you can as your world building allows, or as your story is needed. Okay, so there are 3 basic things that you're going to want to look at when you start developing your history. The first is the creation of your world. How your world got started, its origin stories. Was it created? Did it just happen? Was it a combination of things? Like, how did your world get started? The second is your races and nations, how they were created or came into being, and then how they were divided up into the groups that you have now. And then thirdly, what kind of languages were there at the very beginning of your world, and how have they changed over time to where they are now? Again, you can see how this is very tightly tying into culture. But history of language is going to be very important to you, especially for like an epic high fantasy, because your readers are going to expect that there are going to be different languages. So knowing from the very start of this world building process what kinds of languages you're working with will help you. And I will get more into the details of how to develop your own language in a later video, but for right now, just know that it's important to at least have an idea of, or at least a running list of the languages and your names for these languages and who speaks them and so on and so forth. For languages, something that is very important that you will want to make note of is when certain languages went from just being oral to also being written and read, and if a language at some point, maybe a unique language or a very not commonly spoken language, it doesn't have a written form yet. This seems kind of not important, but it actually is very important, particularly if you are working with small, isolated groups of people, maybe on islands, or maybe like way back in the bush, as our missionary friends used to say. People who don't have a lot of exposure to a variety of cultures, they wouldn't, have caught on that writing is a thing, and they wouldn't have been inspired to come up with a written version of their language. Maybe they have gone to pictorial, where they use pictures to convey things, maybe not even individual words, just like pictures to convey large things. So that will bleed more into the cultural aspects, as we'll get into in the next video, but they're important to make note of now. Just in your overview, which we'll be getting to in a moment, you're going to be writing down the major historical points. And if you have the most common languages, your basic languages that everybody knows about, and maybe everyone doesn't speak, but at least everyone knows about, you're going to want to know at what point in time they went from strictly being oral to being written and read, and if that was like really close to the beginning, or if it's been thousands of years and we're just now getting around to it. And for the various languages, you're also going to want to know this as well. So that's creation, races and division, like how the races came to being and how the country is divided up, and then language and how it has developed over the years. Now we get into the individual categories. So there are 4 main categories of history that we're going to be looking at. The first is world history. The second is, continental or regional history. The third is individual nations and races or people groups. And the fourth is important individual cities, villages, and families. So let's break that down even more, starting, of course, with the first category, which is world history. Now, this one is going to be more of a brief overview, and all of the other categories sort of stem from this. So consider this more of like a basic timeline or a basic outline of the big picture events. These are going to be divided into your eras, into levels of civilization and advancement. You're going to be defined by, of course, the biggies like war and plagues and famines that affect enormous parts of the world and even the entire world itself. And of course, it wouldn't be fantasy without magic. So if magic at all affects history, you need to mention it in your world history overview. And if you are writing like a hard magic system that is supposed to be very key to the plot of your story, then it probably is going to be key to the history of your world. So you really want to bring it in here. Now for magic, you have already done a brief history in your magic system development section. So this is where you can take that and implement it and fill in the gaps sort of your history with what you've already done. You have also already done some level of history when you created your world maps, when you created your fantasy races and creatures. A lot of this has actually already been done for you. Well, not done for you, but you've already done this part. So you understand you've already got the basics figured out. Now you're just filling in the gaps. You're putting in the biggies that you maybe didn't mention before, you hadn't thought of before. You're adding more detail, you're fleshing things out. Again, it doesn't have to be over the top descriptive or super, super detailed. Just the big parts that affect all of your civilizations and the world, and maybe even the structure of the world, if this is magic and magic is holding the world together, or, just go crazy with it. Have fun. Think of some points of history in our world that affected everything, and then see how you can put a spin on it, put a little fantasy spin on it, make it magical, make it unique. The second and third, I believe I mentioned before, can kind of be combined, where you have continental/regional history and then individual nations and races and people groups. If you have I'm not sure exactly how to say this. if you have big important happenings in a region or a continent, and you have maybe only 2 or 3 countries in that continent, then there may be a lot of stuff that repeats between the regional history and the individual country history. However, I would still urge you to go ahead and do them separately, because there are things, when you think about it, the North American continent, I'm going to use mine because this is where I'm from, and I hope that's okay. It's what I'm most familiar with. But in the North American continent, you have the United States of America, you have Canada, and if you just take those 2 countries, there's a lot of history that happens between them, but there's also tons of history that happens separately. And then if you have a place like, a continent of South America, Africa, Europe, where there's tons of countries, well, then of course you have to have separate ones, because there's so many individual nations and so many individual people groups. And the thing about the nations and the people groups, and again, we discussed this before in some of the earlier categories, is that very rarely in history do we have a country that just starts off at the beginning of creation as this nation, and it never changes, it never expands its boundaries, it never splits up, it never morphs into something else, it's never overtaken by another country. You're going to have so much, what's the right word? So much conflict, and so much expansion, and so much growth, and so much prosperity, and so much poverty, and so much war and famine and pestilence, and so many different things are going to affect your history, that it's important to go ahead and have your regional history and then your nation history. And as far as both of those categories are concerned, you're going to use the same list as you did in your world history. You're going to have your eras, you're going to have your advancements in technology, so from back when, they were using very simple, hammers, and when they first invented the wheel, and then to where they've got metal-plated armor, then to when they've got electricity, then to all of a sudden now we have all these modern conveniences, total, so many eras. And you need to think that where your story happens in time, if it starts pretty close to creation, then there may not be as many eras, but if you have it where it's been thousands of years, or even more, then there are going to be so many eras. You really want to take your time, and you can look at our world history. You can look at our world history and see where you have had, where certain advancements in certain areas sped up the civilization's advancement, and it created a new era for them, whereas maybe another area of the world didn't have that technological advancement or that society advancement or whatever, and they didn't advance to a new era for a certain amount of time. You think about in our world, you also have Western history versus Eastern history, where there was not necessarily a physical boundary, like a big wall that was built, but there are really 2 histories. If you look at it, you have the Western civilizations and their advancement, and then you have more what happened in the East. And then on top of that, you have many of the continents and islands and things that they had their own histories going on that we never knew anything about until our exploration era. So you just be thinking about, all the different things, and the levels of discovery, the levels of isolation, the levels of sharing of technologies and advancements between countries and between regions, and maybe even a little bit of bickering. Remember the real history versus perceived history? Maybe in your world you have something like the printing press, where there are people who think that it was invented in this country first, and there are people who think it was invented in this country first, and a variety of different things like that. So just take your time, again, look back at our world history, and maybe look up, Google things, Google eras, Google advancements in society, Google, what creates an advance into a new era, and things of that nature. We'll get more into those again in the culture episode, which is coming right after this, but just be thinking. Go through those categories, go through those, what I would call inspiration thoughts, and then just take off with them, and with the world history, you don't have to get as detailed, but this is your chance during the regional and continental and the individual countries to really kind of flesh out what's been happening in the place where your character is going to be spending a lot of their time, where they came from, where they grew up, and it's going to really affect the story later on. And then, of course, the 4th thing you're going to want to build a history for and develop a history for is individual cities, villages, pause, I have to look down, sorry, cities, villages, and families. These are, and you could probably even add to this list. In fact, I would add right now maybe educational systems or religious systems. If you think about in our world history, you have a variety of religious-based groups who all stem back to a similar one. But when they sprinkled off, and then let's say, if we were doing a modern-day story, you have a character of a pastor and his wife and how they're trying to deal with the denomination issues. I mean, all that history, you're not going to mention it all, but you have to know how they got to be this church. So maybe you have a religious institution, an educational institution, something of that nature that needs a lot of attention as far as history goes, or a very specific school, or a very specific order of knights, or something like that. So if it's an individual city, village, family, group of people, take time to develop their histories. If it's important to your story. And this one, the fourth one, I would say is the only one that is optional. If your character doesn't come from a family of any importance, and they don't really have any connections to their family, if the town where they come from at the beginning of the story isn't really going to play much part in the story, then maybe you don't need to know its entire history. But I would venture to guess that 90% of the time, there is some place and some people group, some family or some government or some institution that needs to have a history, because it is that important to the story. So basically, go through the ideas that you have of the world that you've already set up, and if there's a place or a people group like this, then write it down and take a little bit of time to delve into their history. Maybe not the forever history, but their origin story, how they've developed along the way, and where they are now. It can be very simple, it can be 10,000 pages long, just whatever works for you and for your story. You also want to consider some of the fables and the stories that have come about since your people group, whatever people group you're working with, have come into existence, the stories that they have developed along the way. And again, everything goes back to you have real history, you have perceived history, and from perceived history, everyone develops their own stories. So you want to take a minute and look at some of the stories that have developed in the regions, in the countries, and in specific places. Even as specific as a family ghost, if that is important to your story. And this is where you can kind of nitpick a little bit more, because you don't necessarily need all of that unless it plays a huge part in your book, but it's good to know if at all relevant to the history, to the culture, and to characters. So if you have any kind of, I'm going to look at my list again to make sure that I get this right, but if you have legends and mythologies, you're going to have folklore and tall tales, and you're going to have written and oral versions of these stories, which will depend on the levels of advancement of the societies. So starting off with legends and mythologies. These are stories that almost everyone knows, and that most in that area believe to some degree. Of course, when you think about mythology, the very first thing that comes to mind is the Romans, the Greeks, the Vikings with their Norse mythology. To them, it was real. It was the slightly exaggerated stories, but that they believed that it was actually true. They believed that these gods were real, that these things that happened were real. In some cases, they believed in creatures that were real, and they believed in a future that was real. They had their epic tales. They had all of that going on with this. So when you think mythology, you also have to remember, again, real versus perceived. And when you're coming up with mythology and you're coming up with legends, when you're coming up with legends, these are more like Robin Hood and King Arthur. They're stories that may have originated in truth, but they've come so far that it's hard to tell if there was any truth to these at all. And they're more like, blown out of proportion characters if they really did exist. So legends are more just like the stories of people or of events that most people don't really believe happened, or if it did, it didn't happen quite that way. So they're less likely to actually be believed by the people. When you're thinking about mythology and legends, think very carefully about the origins of the story. How much of it do you want to be true? How much of it do you want to be inspired by something or someone that was real? And how much of it do you want to be just pure made-up fantasy? Which is funny since we're talking about fantasy. But how much of it do you want to be completely made up? How much of it do you want to actually be believed by people in general? And how much do you want to be just kind of something that's a nicety that's added to the story, but most people don't believe it? It's also important to remember that there will always be small groups of extremists who believe every single word of a mythology, and there will be small groups of people who don't believe a single word of it, or large groups of people. That depends. And again, Not all of the mythology and the legends will be important to your story, but all of it will be important to your cultures. And the better developed and understood the cultures are by you as the author, the more that will come through in the story, and the more full and realistic your world will feel. Now we get to folklore and tall tales. They could technically be tied in with legends and mythology, but they are really better separated. They're more of like, again, tall tales, we think of the Wild West, right? And we think of Pecos Bill and, those kinds of characters that they were actual people or they were actual events, but they have been blown way up out of proportions and have all kinds of crazy stories that have been made up about them and things that was not even humanly possible. And yet these stories live on, and that's how we remember them, is through the folklore and the tall tales. So consider what kind of characters or events really happened but have been blown up out of proportion and have been added non-realistic in your world by your magic system and all the fantasyness of that. How is it not real, and how is it not possible according to the rules of your world? You could even, and a lot of fantasy novels do this, take the folklore or even take some of the mythology and make it turn out to be real, and it wasn't blown out of proportion, you just thought it was. And so those are some fun plot points to play with, but you really do need to pay attention in doing folklore and tall tales to real versus perceived. This is kind of a recurring thing. You're going to hear it pretty much on every point in this video, but it's so true. Real, factual history versus perceived history. It's going to be different in every place. So maybe you have a country that has a variety of regions, and maybe each region thinks about this character or this event differently, and the tall tales vary, and they're completely different. That can be a point of very minimal conflict for your character or major conflict for your character, depending on how important the folklore is. And then, of course, lastly, you need to decide how this history has been passed on, both history and mythology and folklore, and this will bleed more into the cultures, but just kind of in your general world history, at what point does it go from being oral or pictorial to being written down in languages? And the last point of history before we move on to culture is notable historical figures. This, like so many of the other points, doesn't seem necessary, and it certainly doesn't have to be, like a notable historical figure for every single war, for every single era of, the golden age, for every single country to have an entire list of their notable characters. This is just the notable historical figures of the different countries, the different people groups, the different parts of the world, maybe of world history itself, that were truly, truly important to the turning of a new era, to the bringing about of peace, to the destruction of a whole part of the world, to the discovery of a religion, to an invention that has changed history. We're talking about the world changers. These ones you absolutely must write down. They come in from a variety of categories. I'm going to give them to you in just a moment, but just to reaffirm, this is not something you want to skip, because the world changers are the ones who inspire us. When we read back through history and we see someone who stood up and did something when those around them would not, whether it be positively or negatively, it changes us. We want to be like those heroes. Or maybe in our villains' case, they want to be like the villains. Or maybe, like our gray characters, they're inspired by both and want to emulate both and see the good or the right in both. And that is part of what is making them conflicted. And also, notable historical figures are going to affect history, which means that they are going to affect the outcome, which is where your story lands. And if you don't know who the world changers were, it just makes it that much harder to feel like your world is alive and that your world is real. So this list does not have to be exhausted. It just needs to include people of a special significance in world history, or in the history that is essential to the plot of your story and the development of your cultures. And this point as well will bleed into the cultures a lot, because people who stand out in history tend to be the people that affect culture the most. And it will also bleed a little bit into our mythology if you have a religious system, because people, again, people of note, people who step up and do something, they tend to be the ones who inspire generations after them. So I'm going to be looking down because I have to read the list. I'm just going to read a list of areas that notable historical figures can come from. So of course we have political and military. Those are pretty high up on anybody's list, because the two biggest things that happens are governments are formed and wars happen. And then of course religious is right up there with it, because religions are a big part of our world, and of course will be a big part of your fantasy world. Maybe not as big, but you still need to make note of the few. Scientific, because they make the advances in society a lot of times. Medical, advances in medicine are huge, and the people who step up again and do something, they're the ones who change the world for the better. So if you have a story, and a lot of high fantasies especially have these where they have great wars, the amount of medical advancement you have is going to have been started by someone in history, so you need to make note of them. You have agricultural, you have, I'm going to so mess this word up, philanthropic. So people who made a big splash in the philosophy realm. And then, of course, the world would not be complete without your romantics and your bizarre people. So these are people, a lot of times, like, for romances, you have your big couples. These are your power couples. They go out and they change the world, but they also have a sweet love story, and it just inspires the romantics and the artists and the creators. And for your bizarres, these are extremists, what less sensitive people might call your historical nutcases. Basically, people who stood up for something that maybe wasn't worth standing up for, or that stood up for something that should be stood up for, but they did it in a way that was completely not right and completely chaotic, and who really sent out the wrong kind of ripples. If they made the ripples, they made the waves, but they did it in the wrong way, and it wasn't right. Now, they don't necessarily have to be clinically insane, certainly not, because a lot of these people are more just obsessed, and or maybe they're just fed up and they just want to go out and they want to make waves. So these ones, and the romantic couples and the philanthropic maybe even, don't necessarily need to be as huge to your stories and to your histories, but you should certainly consider them as you go through and you are writing up your notable historical characters. Now, what do you need to do for these characters? You don't need to give them all, full histories, unless that's your thing. If that's your thing, go for it. And especially if you're contemplating maybe doing some prequels or some novellas or short stories from different places throughout history in your world, that is awesome, and this will definitely give you a big pool of resources for that. But largely what you need to do is just write down their name, where they're from, what their era was, and the very specific timestamp of when they made their mark on history, or if it was an entire era that they made their mark on history on. Their lifespan, when they were born, when they died, and then just maybe like a line or two or even a paragraph about what it was that they changed and why they're worth noting. And if they come into the story at all, maybe mentioned, or the hero takes great inspiration from them, or another character takes inspiration from them, or they're going to be mentioned at some point in the story, make a note. Maybe use a colored pen, or put a sticker by them, or just some way that you'll be able to visually see it very quickly that this person is going to be in the book, so maybe I need to give a little bit more information about them. All right, congratulations! You made it through point 4, which is history. I just would like to apologize if the noise or if the camera, I know the camera angles have changed a lot. I am dealing with some technological difficulties. Thank you so much for your patience with me as I've been working through those. Next video coming up in this series will be the last video of the series, and of course that will be cultures, and I'm so excited to be able to share that with you. Going through this material has opened my eyes to so many different possibilities and so many options for things that I would never have thought of until I was going through and making this series on world building. So there is definitely going to be a lot more material coming. I hope that this was all helpful to you and got you thinking, got those creative juices flowing, gave you some great material to work with. This segment in the workbook will probably be the shortest, but it will also probably be one of the longer ones that you have to go through. So I just would encourage you to be patient, give yourself grace, and give yourself the time that you need to work through each of these steps. I promise you it will be so worth it. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a big thumbs up. It goes a long way to support me and my channel, and of course this series. And then comment down below about what your personal favorite part of developing histories is when it comes to world building. I would love to see that and chat with you about it. Again, if you want to see when the next video pops up, make sure that you are subscribed to my channel and that you have clicked the little notification bell, because I'm not entirely sure when the next video will come up, and that will let you know. As always, I hope you have an amazing rest of the week writing, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye! Bye.